John chapter 5, we're going to do this one in two parts. We're calling this one not the pools of Bethesda, but the Asclepieion of Bethesda, because we're going to look at the geographic background of what we think is the best guess for what these pools of Bethesda, what was actually going on there. What in the world is an Asclepieion? Well, I'm glad you asked, because you came to the right place. We're going to answer that question as we move through this lesson. We're going to cover John chapter 5 in two parts. So in the first part, we'll look at the background. What was this unnamed feast of the Jews of the Judaioi? There's a problem with verses 3b and 4 that occur in the King James and the New King James, but not really seen in the other translations. So we'll look at what's going on there. And then where, and more importantly, what were these pools of Bethesda? We'll unpack that, and you have a hint that it's related to this term Asclepieion. Although I tend to geek out at these things, the meat of the lesson really comes with Jesus' discourse on the relationship of the Son to the Father, and that will be covered in lesson 2 when we go verse by verse. So we'll look at the healing, why the leadership was upset, and then we'll look at the discourse itself. So we'll get our bearings and read the first few verses of John chapter 5. After these things, there was a feast of the Judaioi, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. Now in Jerusalem, by the sheep gate, there is a pool, which in Hebrew is called Bethesda, having 5 porticos. In these porticos lay a multitude of those who were sick, blind, limping, or paralyzed. So right off the bat, we're told there was a feast, but we aren't told what the name of it is. And so it's really interesting that John didn't give us the name of the feast. And in one sense, omitting the name of the feast may be a clue that the location of the miracle, as we'll look at in this background video, is not in any way connected with Judaism. It's actually a pagan center. When we get to John chapter 9 and the location of that healing, the man is told to wash in the pool of Siloam. Now that pool was connected to the Jewish temple, and it was actually inside the city walls at the time. It's outside the walls today. So the entire complexion of John 9 is vastly different from John chapter 5, and it's a great study to compare the two, and we'll get to that when we get to John chapter 9 in several weeks. So what is this feast? There were 3 mandatory feasts required by the Torah: Passover, Shavuot, which we may know as Pentecost, and the Feast of Sukkot, which we may know as Tabernacles. There were also several minor feasts that were not compulsory. Some scholars think this was actually a minor feast, and that could have been why John didn't name it. That may be, although in John chapter 10, we're going to see that Jesus does attend one of these minor feasts, and John clearly says it's the feast that we call Hanukkah. It's in the winter, and it's about the temple rededication that can only be Hanukkah. So, he named it there. He didn't name it here if it's a minor feast. Our working hypothesis is that whenever John says it's a feast of the Judaioi, whether he names it or not, we're going to presume it's one of the 3 major feasts. Why do we do this? Well, several different groups, namely the Samaritans and the Essenes, had different feasts of Passover, Shavuot, and Tabernacles because they all followed the Torah. So, but they all did it a little differently, and maybe they had different dates on the calendar. So our thought is when John says it's a feast of the Jews or of the Judaioi, he is clarifying that this is one of the 3 major feasts that is observed in the way that the Jewish people would have observed it, as opposed to the way the Essene people observed it or the way the Samaritans observed it. So if we assume it's one of the 3 feasts, Passover doesn't really fit the chronology because we just had that in John chapter 3, and it would be just way too many Passovers in Jesus' ministry to fit what we presume is our 3.5 years. So then that kind of rules that out. This is probably the feast of Shavuot or Sukkot. Shavuot's in May and Sukkot's in the fall, and either of these would have been in the same year following the Passover in John chapter 3. The feast, it just says a feast, but when we see the term the feast, that usually refers to the feast of Sukkot in the fall. And the pool of Siloam, which is the one mentioned in John chapter 9, was actually directly associated with Sukkot. So that might be another clue. We're juxtaposing this pool with the pool of Siloam, and they happened at the same feast. Who knows? It's just all speculation. But in some sense, we can almost ask why John bothered at all to mention that there was a feast, because it has no bearing on the events of the chapter. Remember, we say Judaioi because most of our translations say Jews, but that can be misleading. We don't know if we're talking about all Jews, some Jews, Jewish religion, Jewish politics. So we say Judaioi really to kind of make us ask that question, which group of Judaioi, it's the Greek word for Jews, which group are we talking about? Here, obviously, it's a part of the religious system of the Jewish people. Next geographic clue we get, it says Jesus went up to Jerusalem. And this is not a big deal, but just kind of the way it was, in order to avoid Samaria, we talked about that when we looked at John 4, many Jews traveled what was called the ascent of Adumim. And they would go down the Jordan River, get to Jericho, and then there was this very steep path that went straight up. We tend to say up when we go north and down when we go south, but because of Jerusalem's elevation, and more importantly, its status, it is always said that you go up to Jerusalem. And even if you're conceivably traveling from a higher elevation, you're still going up to Jerusalem. That's just how special and how sacred it was. John mentions many of Jesus' Judean encounters, whereas the synoptic gospels tend to focus on his Galilean ones. So really, other than the final week, John really is focusing on those events that took place outside of Galilee. So our next question is, where were these pools of Bethesda? In the 1960s, archaeologists identified what we think are these pools, what we now believe are these pools, just north of the Temple Mount. So that main rectangular area is Temple Mount. You can see the golden Dome of the Rock there, and then we just inch a little bit north, and then this is where these pools of Bethesda are today, just north of the Temple Mount. Again, these would be outside of the city walls, and we'll look at that on a map on the upcoming slide. So we have Jesus interrupting his Galilean ministry, and he comes to Jerusalem. We don't know what time of year, we don't know what festival, but in any case, on a Shabbat, he's going to enter the pools of Bethesda, which is interesting when we think about these being pagan. And he's going to heal a man who's been lame for 38 years. And so there's still some debate about what these were, but most conservative scholars believe these pools were not associated with the Jewish temple, but with the Greco-Roman god of healing, Asclepius. And here's a picture of Asclepius, always pictured with the serpent, as in this drawing. And so just kind of creepy, right? You know, when you're a Judeo-Christian background and, you know, the word serpent just conjures up bad things right off the bat. So an Asclepieion is a pagan center of what I would say so-called healing based on this cult of Asclepius. And that is what we think these pools of Bethesda were. So that really changes the complexion of the story. We have this man, we later find out he's Jewish because he's going to go to the temple. But he's been waiting for most of 38 years on a superstitious, pagan, maybe satanic healing. Here's a map of what we think Jerusalem looked like in the time of Jesus, and you can see the pools of Bethesda in box E. And you can see that thick line indicates that these pools were outside the city walls. And I think that's symbolically important. This man, we later learn he's Jewish, but he is outside of the system. He is wandering far from God, and of course Jesus goes and gets him and heals him. So we've got the Antonia Fortress there, and then we've got this sheep gate that probably led from the temple area down to this unwalled part of the city. So despite the pool's proximity to the temple, from an archaeological standpoint, these pools were outside the system. So they're not part of the Jewish system. They're actually pagan. Greeks and Romans had many of these Asclepieion throughout the empire, and we'll talk about that as we move through the study. But for our purposes, understanding that these pools are pagan and not Jewish changes the entire complexion of the passage. We'll get into that as the study unfolds. So Jesus is really on a mission of restoration with this man. John 9, we mentioned, contains a very similar story to John chapter 5, but there are also several contrasts, and we'll get into that when we really dig into John chapter 9. For example, in John 9, he tells the man born blind, Jesus does, to go wash in the pool of Siloam, which is box F on this map. You can see still within the city walls of that day. But, why didn't he tell the man to wash in the pool of Bethesda, which was much closer? And why didn't he tell the man in John 5 to go wash in the pool? So kind of what's going on here with water, which is one of our major themes working through John. So this hypothesis that the pools of Bethesda were an outside pagan system, it's starting to overlay with the biblical narrative nicely. We can sort of get an understanding of why Jesus is doing what he's doing. He wants nothing to do with the water of these pools, but he wants everything to do with the living water that is represented by the pool of Siloam. And then speaking of archaeological excavations, this is kind of exciting, kind of a tangent here. work has just started on excavating the full extension of the Pool of Siloam. Now, typically, for years, only this northern tip where you can see the people sitting, only that part was accessible. But really, the week we were there, in mid-January, they had just started excavating the entire pool, and that's kind of funny. So this picture was published in an archaeological blog at the end of January. It's not of our group, but I almost had to double check to make sure it wasn't, because we were right there when all this was happening. And so this will be very exciting once it's finished, and possibly, we'll see these pools filled with water again. That would be pretty exciting. Verse 5, now a man was there who had been ill for 38 years. And so if you're paying attention, you may have noticed we skipped from verse 3 down to verse 5. And as we said in the introduction, we now know that these verses that are included in the King James and New King James are definitely an error. They're not in the most reliable manuscripts. And then the next question is, well, why are they there? So let's go ahead and read what is in the New King James. In these lay a great multitude of sick people, blind, lame, and paralyzed. That's included in all the other versions. But then we have this part, waiting for the moving of the water. For an angel went down at a certain time into the pool and stirred up the water, that whoever stepped in first after the stirring of the water was made well of whatever disease he had. Now that just sounds kind of wrong, right? That doesn't sound like the way our God works. And so what scholars think is a well-meaning scribe was trying to resolve this question in John 5 verse 7. The sick man answered him, "Sir, I have no man to put me in the pool when the water is stirred up." So the scribe maybe came up with some tradition of an angel, and your mind immediately goes to an angel of the Lord stirring down and stirring up the water. And so it's the problem is including verse 4 leaves us with exactly the wrong impression of what's going on. As we've talked about, these are not Jewish pools, even though they're nearby the temple. We're outside the city walls, and it was not an angel of the Lord who stirred up the waters. In fact, just the opposite. In the 90s, we found other evidence that these pools were definitely part of an Asclepieion, which is a pagan healing center. Over 400 of these Asclepieion centers have been identified throughout the Roman Empire, so they're everywhere, and we can infer that they were just a big part of life. It's just what you did if you were part of the Roman system. Interestingly enough, the largest one of these, the most massive one, is in Pergamum, and it was sort of the headquarters of the Asclepieion cult. And you may remember Pergamum as one of the 7 churches in Revelation 2 and Revelation 3, where Jesus issues 7 letters to those churches, those assemblies of believers. And it's interesting that Pergamum is the city that Jesus referred to, and he said, where Satan has his throne. There are several different candidates for who he might have been referring to, but given the size of Pergamum and, of course, the snake imagery, the Asclepieion there in Pergamum was a good candidate. Asclepius was a god who had healing and resurrection powers, and he used the blood of Medusa, and that's how he comes to be associated with snakes. So keep that in mind when Jesus is giving his discourse towards the end of John chapter 5, middle and end of John chapter 5. He's going to talk about, who has the real power to resurrect the dead and give eternal life. So it's as if, and I use that in quotes, Jesus is contrasting what he can bring with what these Asclepieion centers are advertising. So quite fascinating there when you start to understand the background. The snake gives him healing powers, and there's a snake imagery everywhere. You can see it on the pillar. You can see it on this coin from Pergamum. They're very proud of this snake imagery. Early medicine in the ancient world was directly associated with serpent worship. And it's interesting that Asclepius had 2 daughters, Hygeia and Panacea, which is where we get our words today, hygiene and panacea. And the symbol was actually a snake around a pole. And this is likely a corrupted version of Moses lifting up the serpent in the wilderness. I'll talk about that on a separate slide. But what I find really fascinating is that symbolism still persists today. So you can see the symbol of the American Medical Association is none other than a serpent wrapped around a pole. And I just find that really fascinating and kind of disturbing at the same time. Many other medical organizations incorporate Asclepius and the serpent. So if you're wondering where that serpent imagery, it comes directly from the god Asclepius. Now, what's even more interesting is that the serpent on the pole goes way back to Numbers 21. And this is the story when the Israelites grumbled against God and against Moses. They complained that God sent them in the wilderness to die, and basically doubted God's promises. And of course, we never do that. So they complained to Moses, and Moses tells them to do. God tells Moses to do something that admittedly is very odd. In Numbers 21:8, make a fiery serpent out of bronze and set it on a pole. Everyone who is bitten, when he sees it, shall live. And we talked a little bit about this when we were looking at John chapter 3. So this works. People look at it and they're saved. What is interesting about this is that 700 or 800 years later, the original pole is still around and is now becoming an item of idolatry. So the very thing that Jesus has most against the assembly at Pergamum is following idolatrous practices is actually happening among the Israelite people. And the king Hezekiah, during one of his religious reforms, did what was right in the eyes of the Lord. He smashed the bronze serpent that Moses has made, for until those days, the people of Israel had made offerings to it. And that's in 2 Kings 18. So very interesting that this healing, mystical healing power from the serpent on a pole goes way back and even into the Bible as a corruption of what Moses did. So just as Jesus did in John chapter 3, by the end of John chapter 5, Jesus is going to tie all of this together on what he is teaching back to what Moses wrote 1500 years earlier. And, by extension, the law of Moses is the prosecutor here. And we're going to get into that when we get into part 2. So just as one who didn't follow the procedure with the serpent on the pole died physically, one who doesn't heed Moses' words that point to Jesus will die spiritually. So all of this is going to be tied together in John chapter 5. So back to this concept of Asclepieion. So people in need of healing would travel to one of these, and the one in Pergamum was just absolutely massive. It had healing chambers, sacred pools, mud baths, a medical library, using that phrase very loosely, and even a theater for entertainment. So it was really a combination of religious worship of this god Asclepius. They would mix in sedative and hallucinogenic drugs, sometimes snake venom, and they all would say that brings about healing. So it was something like, entertainment center, late 60s, Haight-Ashbury district kind of hippie craziness, hospital, pagan temple, spa, kind of all rolled into one. Emperor Hadrian was actually a patient at the Asclepieion in Pergamum, so it was a big deal. Lancaster, in his commentary, reports that the patients were given a drug, and then they would enter the complex by way of this dark tunnel, which you see on the screen here. And, they would hear, quote unquote, hear voices. And you can see there's openings, and it would actually be priests that would, chant incantations as the patients were hallucinating, walking down the place. And then they would lie in a bed, and snakes would actually be loosed to slither over the patient. And, of course, the patient in a drug-induced state would hear the snakes speak. We don't know that the Asclepieion in Jerusalem was actually this elaborate. In fact, it appears it was not. But one problem is the constant building and rebuilding in Jerusalem makes any definite conclusion a challenge. But in any case, you get the idea. This place is creepy by our standards, and a person claiming faith has absolutely no business being here. So the picture is an aerial shot of the excavations, and it's really difficult because there's been Crusader period, Byzantine period, Muslim period, kind of all built on top of this. So you really need to use your imagination, but it is way down there. The inset picture is from the 50-to-1 model of first century Jerusalem, and that's at the Israel Museum. And this is what we think the pools might have looked like. Maybe not exactly, but close. So again, northeastern part of the city, there's a church called St. Anne's that everyone visits. It's a Crusader church, very well preserved, very interesting acoustics inside there. So people go in and we'll sing a song a cappella and listen to the reverb there. Again, this area is extremely difficult to visualize, but at the bottom, a good 40 feet down, would they believe they have found these pools. Excavation actually continues to this day, and I was last there in 2013, before I was there last month in 2023, and it's the difference. You can just see the work is continuing. The central portico is pictured on the right, and you can see it marked out, and there's a Byzantine church that's built over this today, so it really is kind of a mess today. If we go back to that model picture, we can speculate what was happening. what they think. So the stirring of the water, getting back to that. So just as when the priests at Pergamum used trickery and drugs to make people think that they were healed, what we think was happening here was that these pagan priests probably opened a valve between the two pools, and that caused the stirring of the water, which they then attributed to gods, and then, well, look, it's a miracle. The gods have spoken. I'm going to go out on a limb and speculate that most of the so-called healings might have been staged. So I think the whole thing is fake news, and Jesus is coming to redeem one of his own from this craziness. So to draw this to a close, why bring all of this up about Asclepieion? Why does it matter? Well, I think understanding the background changes the complexion of the story, as I talked about earlier. This man, who we know is Jewish because he goes to the temple after he's healed, he is paralyzed spiritually. He's seeking healing from a false god. These waters of these pagan pools can't heal him. Only the pure and living water of Jesus can, the Mayim Chaim, which we've read in John chapter 2, 3, and 4. One question is, what in the world is a Jew doing here? And I think this speaks of the compromise that is so easily, we do all the time in our lives. So the characters that Jesus interacts with, we're going to see that they're pictures of each of us, good and bad ways. We need to ask ourselves what we are doing when we're looking to the world for healing or wholeness or things like that. Justin Martyr, the early church father, warned about Asclepius specifically as an imitator of Jesus. When the devil brings forward Asclepius as the raiser of the dead and healer of all diseases, may I not say that in this matter likewise he has imitated the prophecies about Christ? Now, I think that is interesting, and so that'll have direct bearing on the rest of John chapter 5, and Jesus is basically saying, no more imitations, I am the true healer. I do find it interesting that the most egotistical of modern medical doctors, what are they described as having? They're described as having a God complex. In other words, they're imitators of God and not in the good way that Paul describes. So what an interesting term that they use in light of Justin Martyr's quote. Also, what is a fake medical potion called? It's called snake oil. And people who sell those things are called snake oil salesmen. So, all of this imagery is nothing new. Symbolism goes way, way back. And of course, I need to say that not all Western medicine is bad, but the snake imagery that is so common in the industry really should bother us. We can say that's just a historic logo, but, symbolism and imagery is important. And as now we're moving into this realm where medications are changing and altering our DNA and RNA, that should really concern us. Is this medicine or is this something much more sinister going on? And of course, with all this said, we honor those physicians who exercise godly wisdom and who use their skill and education to save lives. And in fact, over the past few years, several doctors have boldly spoken out about dangers and abuses in the medical industry and really blasting this new religion called science that we're just supposed to blindly put our trust in. And many of those have faced sanctions and even lost their medical license for standing up what is best. So pray that there are more like them and standing up for their patients. So with all of this background, let's go ahead and dig into the real meat of John chapter 5, which is Jesus' discourse, and we'll cover that in part 2.